We also may have Trudy Wright, and apologies for not mentioning you, Trudy.
She's not actually here, but she's contributed
okay.
significantly, so I felt her name should go up there.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Lindsay, who's from the University Hospitals of Derby and Burton NHS Foundation Trust. Over to you.
Cool. So the project's been mentioned already. So what is Yewno? It's a search product which uses artificial intelligence, and as you can see, it's about highlighting resources and connections that you may not have thought of. And I thought what I'd do at this point is I would do a demo of it. So for that, I am going to have to unshare and reshare. Can you see that Google window?
I can.
Brilliant, thank you. So this is Yewno. So I click on, I get this message. We've all seen this type of message before. Oh, no. So the access is a smidge click heavy. They do have to click nhs.uk when they log in here. And they also need to put their Athens account in as well, but I've already done that this morning, so it's remembering who I am. So I'm just going to show you the demo that we used with our users. So I decide which kind of concept I'm most interested. So let's go for type 2. And it gives me this graph of all the related concepts. So these dots represent a concept, so complications, insulin resistance, CATs. These lines represent the connection between those two topics. Now, if I click on the dot, it changes over in the left-hand side to say that we're now looking at complications of diabetes, or I can click on this dot in the middle, diabetes. If I click on one of the lines, let's go for impaired fasting glucose. You can see that I get my two images for my two concepts, and it says that it's looking at the two things. So why is that useful? So here, if I click back on diabetes, obviously we're wanting to find relevant documents. That's in the Documents tab here. And I suspect you'll be noticing many of the things that we've noticed ourselves. If I want to limit to more recent articles, I can do. So let's say that I want to see what's come out in the last 3 years. And it's taken its time, but this is where we are. If I can now favorite some of these. Let's favorite those. I can go back to my knowledge map using this link at the top. There is a slider, so at the moment it's set here on the right to find the strongest connections, so the 50% of strongest connections. If I want to see what are the kind of less strong connections, so less strongly connected in the literature, I can pull this down, and you can see I get more things coming up. If I decide I want to look at really obscure stuff, I can move the top end of the slider down, and that will show me the weird and wonderful things. Although, as you can see, they're not all so weird there that you would see. So I'm going to go back up to the top. Some of these get quite complicated, so you can zoom in and out. You can also decide, I'll show you the snapshot thing because that's easiest to understand. I can take a snapshot of this graph for saving later. We do tell people to save as they go because it's not very good at remembering where you've been or allowing you to manipulate things that you're finished with. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell it that I want it to create a new knowledge graph based on things that I've chosen. So I'd look at this, I'd say, oh, that looks interesting. I want to investigate that a bit further. multi-select. Let's go for ketoacidosis, sitagliptin, and abdominal obesity. And I don't know why they have two different buttons here. So if you're just looking at two concepts, you would click on this button. If you look, you can have up to 8. If you're looking at more than 2, you would click create new knowledge map. And it takes, depending on your network connection, this blue bar is really useful for telling you whether things are happening or not. I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but it's slowly going across as it thinks. Still thinking. So there we go. And you can see this is much more complex. So it's looked at these 3 things that I've said that I'm interested in. Again, you've got your click on the little circle and it takes you to that concept and those documents. Click on a line. So if I'm interested in this one, abdominal obesity, hyperglycemia, again, it shows me relevant documents. So, and now I'm going to go back to knowledge map. This button layer on the right hand side. So I've got 2 layers. This is my original map, knowledge graph, sorry. Not quite sure why it's all so yellow. Or if I go back, I can also go into this bottom layer. So you can move between them using that option. So that is essentially most of what Yewno does. You can save in the left-hand side. So I can decide that this picture that I've taken, I want to export that. I think this reference is useful. And I just want some kind of record that I've looked at this topic and thought it was useful. So the save options are here. You can see that the save options are Google Docs, RIS and CSV. Those are the only options. Obviously, RIS and CSV won't take you knowledge maps. So if they do want to export any pictures, they do need to export to Google Docs. We were pleasantly surprised by how many of our test users already had a Google account and were happy with Google Docs. But obviously, there's an issue there. So that's more or less what Yewno does. So, given that I've just given you the whistle-stop tour, we're going to go back and say, okay, what is it trying to do? So, all the work is done by Yewno. So, as you can see, I didn't need any special skills just now. I pointed, I clicked. At the moment, I am not sure how much impact Yewno will have on how we search. Me and my colleagues, we were really interested in what it might be able to do in terms of suggesting new areas, bringing up concepts that you weren't, that you hadn't thought of, highlighting potential ideas where there is a connection in the literature, but maybe it's not well researched, those kinds of things. But we'll come on a bit later to practically what the response was from our end users. So, as Ken has mentioned, we started off with some focus groups in February and March. So we got those by emailing out to people that we knew. We tried to get a spread of people who were quite IT confident and people who were not quite IT confident. So we wanted that spread. We didn't just want the people who were like, I love technology, I love IT. So the focus groups gave Ken a bit of a chance to kind of talk to people about the jobs to be done. Then Ken did the first interview with people in March 2020. And we just had 10 participants for that. We did, obviously, as always, we contacted a lot more than 16 people. On the day, obviously, there were clinical commitments stopping people turning up. There was staff sickness stopping people turning up. So, we had the same kind of challenges that everybody does with this kind of thing. COVID-19 obviously hit. So we were meant to be doing our user training in April, but there was a trust ban on training. So the training was deferred until July to September. So we very carefully hadn't shown people Yewno before we did the training with them, because we wanted to get an understanding of what it was people needed before we showed it to them. And then obviously Ken is doing the second interviews, and I think he's done 8 or 9 of those. Maybe he's done all 10. Yeah, and obviously this will be written up. I'm not sure there's anything else to say about that. So we are working on an implementation toolkit, which will be advice for libraries that are implementing Yewno, and Ken is also doing a report. Watch this space for those. So the benefits. So the way Yewno works is the artificial intelligence is creating those networks. And the way it's doing that is it's going through all of the literature and it's finding individual concepts, individual topics, and then it's looking at the connections between them. So the advantage of that is it's driven by the literature itself. So it's not a librarian putting in an index and saying this topic is relevant, this topic is not relevant. It means that as terms change, because Yewno is constantly updating itself with the literature, the terminology will change. So I know we've all had the problems where you find yourself typing some extremely discriminatory and outmoded terms into the databases just because the thesaurus hasn't kept up with the fact that we no longer use the term mental retardation, for example. With Yewno, because it's keeping up to date with the concepts and the concepts are derived from what's actually been published, it keeps up to date with the new terms as the new terms come into use. We found a lot of people like that visual way of displaying knowledge and connections. It is a different way of looking at things to your traditional do a literature search, send them a list of results. And it does generate new ideas. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is that sometimes with a connection, in that space where I showed you the documents, you'll get a little image saying there's no documents on this. And what it's saying there is that from the artificial intelligence, there should be a relationship between these two concepts, but there is no. There should be a relationship between these two concepts, but there's no actual literature published on it. So yeah, we were quite excited to be involved in this project. I think it's a really innovative product, both in the kind of graphical way it displays things and in the use of artificial intelligence to kind of find concepts and then bring them together. However, the benefits are not the full story, as always. So you possibly noticed that the user is click heavy. Users receive a message telling them that they're unauthorized, which for those of our users who are less confident, I guess all of us who are library staff are very used to, we see the unauthorized and we look for the next button to click, which will take you past that thing. The Athens accounts also, it wasn't enough to have an NHS Athens account. The email address registered on that Athens account had to be an institutional email address. So we had to tell Yewno what the university institutional email addresses were, so we had to say at nhs.net, at aston.ac.uk, at nottingham.ac.uk, and a couple of other universities that have students on placement here. So I don't know how others are, but certainly for us, I think while it may not be ideal, a number of our users are registered on their Athens accounts with their personal email addresses. Setup and configuration. So I mentioned that Trudy had contributed a lot. Trudy is our e-resources librarian. She has massive technical knowledge. So all I can do for the next few slides is put these up, read them, and Trudy's email address is at the end. So if you have any questions, go back to Trudy. As you can see, our experience with Yewno was great. They were extremely supportive. And from a user education perspective as well, Carola was very happy to do us new videos on how to use Yewno, really responsive. So this slide gives you the different areas that we'll be covering in the next few slides. Koha is the library management system that we use. So the email release policy is the thing about the emails that I mentioned, and you can see that Trudy's put that plan to change the architecture, which obviously would make life a lot easier. However, obviously, as we all know, products, plans and plans being put into action are not always the same thing. So the Yewno widget is essentially where you have a little square in your discovery service where people can type things into Yewno without having to log into Yewno itself. So we weren't able to get this working, and particularly with COVID, it took, because Trudy was redeployed into supporting the COVID response in terms of guidelines and so forth, and that had to take priority. That meant that there was then less time to work on this as we would have hoped. But as you can see, there were this wasn't as smooth as it could have been. So all of the demos we did were about sending the users straight to Yewno itself, as I just did with the demo earlier. And that's Trudy's summary of the situation. Obviously, the nature of a pilot is that we do hope, because of the work that Trudy's done, should Yewno be bought, then hopefully there's information from this pilot that would make the process smoother for anybody else who is subscribing to it. So in terms of using it, so I had a bit of a look myself, and I found that it wasn't really great for clinical searches. And I think the reason why is, as a clinical librarian, you tend to get some very defined topics. So, for example, one of the ones I used as a test was somebody wanted to know about the impact of ASA hip and knee scores on outcomes in arthroplasty. And it's just too specific. On the other hand, the example that we did with our users was diabetes and frailty, and it coped a lot better with that, although it still wasn't excellent. And I do feel that so in the results that you see, the AI brings the most relevant results to the top, and I feel that there's still some work needed to do to improve that relevance. Because certainly for me, whereas in healthcare we're aware that you need to be seeing the latest information, there were definitely topics where I thought there should have been more recent research than was bringing to the top. So I think I did 4 test searches, and of those, 2 were kind of the ASA, that kind of level of detail. And 2 of them were broader, and it brought me up some useful things. So I think Yewno is very good at what it does, but I think it's, as you would expect, it's not going to replace all of our searching. It's, or at least not for some time. So this is based on the feedback from the users. So Ken did the second interviews. I've had a bit of a look through those. I think the general themes were that actually there was a wide range of perspectives among our users. So some found it really easy, some found it more difficult. Some people really liked the visual layout. They really liked the way it made them think. They really liked the way it threw up things that they hadn't thought of. Particularly, we had one person from our hand team. He said that it had made them think about things from a kind of more psychology-based perspective, and that had been really helpful with the particular question that she'd been looking at. It is very much better at handling broad subjects, and we found that there was a tendency, and again, not exclusively, but students tended to find it more helpful than more experienced clinicians. And there were also some people who noticed that it made some connections which were actually unhelpful. So, for example, it might conflate two drug classes which needed to be kept separate, or it might bring up topics which looked related but weren't really. So, you know, in that case, knowledge was needed to be aware that actually, thinks there's a connection there, but there isn't really. And we had a mix of people. Some were very enthusiastic. One person said they had gone as far as looking at an individual subscription for themselves because they found it so helpful. And other people were much more take it or leave it. So I think it's been really interesting to see how it worked and to be involved. But I think, it's got some great things and it's got some less great things, I think, is how I'd probably summarize it. Does anybody have any questions?